draft submission before us that's been authored by Ross Tucker and Andrew Duncan. So Ross and Andrew, in your very capable hands.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so this item is seeking approval of a draft submission on the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Bill. This bill is primarily about funding and financing, so relates to the Finance Committee as well as planning, but due to the timing constraints of when submissions are due, we're bringing it to you today. We did workshop this bill on the 19th of February. We picked up a lot of feedback and comments and have incorporated those comments into the report and into the draft submission itself. The bill provides for private capital to be used to fund and finance growth infrastructure. The bill focuses purely on financing and funding mechanisms. So unlike the Urban Development Bill, it doesn't go into planning regulations, consenting, or any of those other broader override things. It is purely squarely on funding and financing tools. It does enable greater progress with infrastructure than what the council would be able to achieve just with working within its existing debt constraints. By providing another means to enable infrastructure to be provided, that means that more progress can be made faster than relying on the traditional funding sources alone. So this is something that the council has been advocating for some time. We were just going back over the history and saw some submissions we made back in 2015 asking for these kind of tools to be part of the toolkit, because we know that the infrastructure demand to support growth in housing is huge and our debt constraints are limited. So I guess where we're at the moment in terms of the context, we know we've got building consents at record levels, but for that to be sustained into the future, we need to have the infrastructure coming through in the future, and that's what this helps to achieve. The bill, as we've said, does not make any changes to planning laws. Any infrastructure that's funded and financed here, it'll relate to developments and housing projects that have to go through the standard RMA processes, that have to seek consent under the Auckland Unitary Plan, and there's nothing that provides any kind of shortcuts to those processes whatsoever. The draft submission, so in the draft submission that we've got, it does support the bill. For those reasons about needing to support infrastructure to support the growing city, we've got clear support expressed for the use of this tool. There's a few things where we think we can improve on the wording and provide a few clarifications. Attached to the draft submission, there is feedback from 3 of the local boards. We've just received another 4th one that's come through late. All 4 local boards that have chosen to put something forward are supportive of the bill as well, and they've again expressed some concerns, improvements, or things they want the government to consider, which is broadly in line with the overall submission. So within the submission, we do sort of encourage the government to think about applying this tool in a way that's consistent with Auckland Council's growth framework, to fit in with that strategic growth planning framework. We also encourage the government to work in with local communities, use elected members, use the local boards, because we know that successful urban development, successful community building happens when you work very, very closely with the local communities and follow a comprehensive growth framework. So with any kind of infrastructure investment and housing projects, there's a number of risks. So I'll ask Andrew to talk about what are some of the key risks, and also express what are some of the safeguards that have been developed in this bill to respond to that. And you can also comment about some of the improvements and suggested clarifications that we're recommending to make sure those safeguards work as well as possible.
Thanks, Ross.
Good afternoon. Of course, the bill addresses one of the key risks the council's got, and it's new tools to make sure we've got the infrastructure available to support development. But as you know, any infrastructure project does carry some risks. The bill and the government's policy position to support the projects and the levy proposals the bill makes provision for provides for a government support package to address those risks. and that package will be developed on a case-by-case basis, aligned to the nature of the projects that are being put forward. Within the bill itself, the council's got a couple of good tools in there, a couple of good elements to help us be able to manage any risks we might face. So the council's endorsement is required to be looked at by the minister for the specification of the assets that are proposed to be funded by a levy and for the impact those assets have on our wider network. And we have to endorse our ability to fund the operation of those assets after they've been vested in us. Additionally, the bill provides that the council can't provide any guarantee or financial support for an SPV, thus protecting us from the impacts of infrastructure cost overruns, etc. Those elements will be dealt with by the government support package. So there's a number of key safeguards in the bill specifically addressing levy payers and the council. So I've talked about the endorsements the council's asked to provide under the bill, the elimination of financial guarantees from the council, but there's also some protections for levy payers. So when the minister's considering a proposal for a levy, the minister is required to give consideration to issues of affordability and fairness. The levy proposal must cap or set a maximum amount that can be recovered by the levy. And the size of the levy has got to be disclosed, or the levy for an individual property has got to be included on the land information memorandum, making sure that if someone's going to be buying one of these properties, they know what it's going to cost them. So buyers will have this information when they're looking to purchase a property that's a brand new one for sale, or when a subsequent purchaser comes along, they'll take that into account. And it's likely that they'll pay less for a property with a levy than they would pay for one without a levy. But that was a comparable property. So this has been going on at Milldale. So you'll know at Milldale, there's some of the infrastructure at Milldale is funded by the levy. Number of sales have gone ahead for properties in the area, and the buyers have known about the levy, they've taken it into account. They're also can pay it off in a lump sum, which gives them a good indication of the price element. It's $1,000 a house in Milldale, going up at 2.5% a year. And if I bought one of the 3-bedroom properties in Milldale with a 20% deposit, that $1,000 a year I'd pay in the levy would be 2.6% of the mortgage payments I'd have to make. So just to put the levy's affordability in context. Now, I said before that the bill requires the levy to be on the land information. There's also a monitor appointed by the Crown to keep an eye on the levy and the SPV, and they've got to publish information about the levy to enhance public understanding and to monitor its application over time to ensure it remains appropriate. In our draft submission that you're looking at today, we're recommending that the government give a bit more consideration to add a bit of reinforcement to that, to include it on the title and to require sellers to let prospective buyers know about the levy. We've got a few other technical points in the submission, seeking some clarification on some of the key elements and some suggestions as to how some other changes they could make that would make it work better. We do think it'll work as laid out, but there are some improvements that could be made, and they're suggested. In addition, we're also suggesting that the levy be one of the things that can be taken into account when calculating people's eligibility for the rates rebate, under the rates rebate scheme. While people will know about the levy when they buy a property, their circumstances might change over time, and it's only reasonable if this charge on land should be considered alongside rates when looking at the eligibility for the rates rebate. In addition, our submission is suggesting that that the government look at the bill to make sure it would allow for bundling of projects, so not just looking at one project in one area or a group of projects in one area, but being able to add together perhaps smaller projects that might be required to support development in a couple of areas. So it's not just limited to very large projects. And that could also encompass things like allowing for the connection of households on rainwater tanks to the reticulated water network, for example. And that packaging together would allow economies of scale and capital raising to be achieved and make more projects potentially able to benefit from this kind of financing and funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, we probably canvassed a lot of our questions at the workshop, hopefully so, and then both Ross and Andrew have responded. They've made some further changes. I'm just mindful, I do not want to undervalue the work of the staff, but we have had the workshop. I'm just mindful that we could run into a quorum issue if we run too long. So if there are any quick questions, can we furnish those? Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. And I do support your submission. Just a question around in 23 when we talk about the fact that the houses should be relatively lower mortgage repayments, they should be relatively lower prices. I just wonder, just the same as with the affordability type mechanism that we tried with SHAs and it's not working, how do we monitor that? I mean, how do we do that? Because how do you say, well, it should be around this price, but all of those houses in the same area will be around the same price, but it could easily be jacked up and you wouldn't know because you can't compare it with another suburb or another area, another development.
Houses. So theoretically, this should happen. And if you can see the lump sum is, a lump sum payment is 20,000 and you're looking at a house price, then you will think about that. But all houses aren't exactly the same, so we can't say perfectly exactly how it would pan out. But you would expect someone, if they're looking at a house in Milldale versus one in Silverdale, to be taking that into consideration along with all the other features and amenities that each property has available.
Because I think the thing is it's dictated by the market. So, that's why I just concerned that how do you actually make sure developers do take that into account in the price? I sort of feel it's a bit arbitrary leaving it to the buyer because some of them were, it's pretty tough to actually assess that across the region or even in a sub-regional level to say this is dearer than that. 20,000 is just such a variable, subjective thing that people could buy it on emotion and they're prepared to pay more, or because it's near a school they want to go to or something like that. That's so I just wonder if that, when we say that, are we giving an expectation that is hard to meet?
I think that's why we've said should, because all property buyers will be buying for different reasons. And however, if you look over a large number of sales, then people will pay different amounts for properties with different levels of amenity. So that's why perhaps a house near Auckland Grammar might cost more than one where I live. When you're getting into small amounts, exactly how it flows through, it's hard to say. But if you over a large number of sales, you would expect to see a little bit of movement, but not everyone will do the calculations. We want to make sure, with the submission as proposed, is seeking to make sure people know so they have the opportunity to take that into account.
Thank you. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Andrew and Ross, for the submission and the report. In terms of the submission, I read the Hansard, debate, and there's a lot of shade being thrown at the council. So I applaud you or I commend you guys for taking the high road with your submission. There's no response in there to what those MPs are saying about us, but that's okay. Perhaps the Mayor can throw some shade back to them. So in terms of my question, so I had a lot of questions, but I'm not going to ask them. But this is my consumer affairs background coming through, that if something seems too good to be true, then it probably is, which is why I tried to find pitfalls with this. And so my question is around those that live near the development and that use the same facilities or assets. You know, how is that accounted for? Like, I don't want to get to a stage where people gate off their particular area and charge a fee because they paid this levy for that asset. So that's one question. My other question is around clause 88 in the bill, where it talks about the eligible infrastructure that will be transferred under a vesting agreement. And given that a lot of these projects, or the focus of these projects, are for $50 million or more, are we taking on, as that responsible infrastructure authority, any tax implications? My other question is around the endorsement that we give as the responsible infrastructure authority. Does that commit us to providing any further investment in infrastructure in that development? And I think I'll leave those questions. Yeah, I'll leave it at those questions, and I'll just
Thank you.
deal with it. Yeah.
So in regard to the nearby properties, the council already takes that into account when doing its development contributions analysis. So if we're building a park for a new development, we'll have a look at whether people nearby will benefit, and we'll fund the benefit to the new development from DCs, and the other part would come from general rates. If some of the assets in a development to be funded by a levy might have some benefits to existing properties, then the proposer, which in many occasions we'd expect would be the council, would need to consider how that was to be financed and funded. So the council would make that decision. If it was the proposer, it would decide whether it wanted to put a bit of general rate funding in so that there was a fair share of who's paying for the benefits. If it was another party who was proposing, they would need to have the council's agreement in regard to that before they could secure funding outside of being funded by the levy. So we already do give consideration to that in the decisions that the council makes. In regard to the endorsement, the endorsements that the council would give under the bill would only be for the assets for which our endorsement was being sought. So that doesn't require any commitment to the council beyond saying these assets are to a suitable specification and we can fund their OPEX in the future. So that would require no commitment beyond that from us.
Okay.
And on the tax one, Ross?
So on the tax one, so assets built, constructed by developers and then passed to the council, that happens all the time in terms of our vested assets. So we don't see any tax issues there. We do need to be mindful about any assets that move around within the council family once they're vested. So any transfer of assets from a CCO back to the council could be treated as a dividend back from the CCO, which becomes taxable. So it will be important here that we make sure the assets are vested to the right part of the council family so we don't run into any unexpected tax issues.
You did. Thank you. Councillor Casey.
Mine can probably be done under B. It's a little bit of a tootle. It's all to do with the third party introducing a levy, where we say, it's kind of woolly, the last 4 paragraphs, a bit woolly, where we say we're asking the government to promote. Why wouldn't we say that we're asking the government to require third parties to consult? It's just a tweak, really. So the last 2 paragraphs in particular need a bit of beefing up. So they should seek elected member leadership, but they should be required to consult.
Can you just bring us to the page and then the
Page
paragraph?
231, paragraph 56 and 57. It's related to third parties.
It's para 56, the submission.
So in putting legislation together, the government's tried to make the structure as flexible as possible so it can be used to the widest possible a range of applications. So I guess there's when we have statutory consultation requirements, that can add time to a process. So I guess it's envisaged there might be infrastructure, if it's proposed by the council will already consult through its plans. It might be the landowner developer has promoted it, so you're kind of asking them to consult with themselves, ask their own views. So I think it's a requirement of the minister to understand what are the views of the affected parties when they make their decision. But the intention here, I think, in the bill is to be as flexible as possible and provide different ways to make sure the views are taken into consideration, rather than saying, for example, must follow a special consultative procedure, which could add months to a development proposal. So
This is just really, Ross, just third parties only. And what your statement is, and I'll read it to you. The council encourages the government to promote the value of fostering local elected member leadership and community engagement. So instead of saying encourages the government to promote, just asks the government to require. So it's up to them whether they take it on or not. But I think we should be doing that, because what I see is an unscrupulous developer just won't bother and just go straight through and do whatever it is they want. So it is
So the minister would have to take advice on that, and make that decision, and get cabinet to approve it. So it's not the developer would be able to do it; it has to have that government approval. So there's safeguards there. But I guess if the direction of the committee is to be stronger on this point, then we can look to change the wording there.
If there's any support, if not, it can be as is. It was just a reason of concern.
Andrew, can you put your mic off, because it's a bit hard to hear. Thank you. Okay, point taken there. Councillor Cashmore, please.
Thanks, Chris. Just if a minister promotes of housing, or MHUD promotes a development, it was the same minister also going to sign off potentially an SPV, and is there a conflict in that?
I suppose if the same minister was doing it, then it would, yeah, I suppose a conflict potentially if they were both, if the minister was filling both roles. Have they?
So I guess that could potentially happen. There are certain things that the minister must get advice, and there's certain considerations. So there must be evidence. The minister's turned their attention to the relevant matters, and it would all have to go to cabinet for approval. So you couldn't.
That's the check. Okay, I'm with you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Finally, Councillor Hills.
Thank you, and I know I've said this before, but I'm wary of this becoming a vehicle to jump maybe what we should be doing, such as future urban, that is not necessarily planning, or sprawl just because we have this. So I know it's to get money off our balance sheet, but how do we ensure that the integrity of our Auckland Plan, Unitary Plan and others are still held even with this new vehicle? But just because we have the money, should we really be doing this because of the on-flow effects of sprawl, I guess?
Yes, I guess we've had a very close look at the bill, and there's nothing in there that will override the Auckland Unitary Plan. So this, if someone wanted to override the plans, they would need some other mechanism. They'd have to go through RMA processes. So the funding and financing doesn't allow any override of planning controls.
Finally, Councillor Watson.
And you may have covered this in terms of the option of a bulk payment up front, where you deal to the rates for the next 30 years. Did you make any comment about partial lump sum payments or not? So can people make partial lump payments along the way?
So the bill is very flexible in that regard. So at the moment, the way it's drafted, a levy order could make provision for paying it at $1,000 a year for 30 years, or to pay off part of it and the remainder yearly, or to pay off the whole lump sum. So there's no restrictions in that sense. So all those choices would be available, or could be available, depending on how each levy order is produced.
But But at the moment, the way the bill's drafted, if the levy order is set at an amount per year, it doesn't have the flexibility automatically if an individual wanted to pay the lump sum either in full or partial. And we do kind of, in the draft submission, we recommend that the government thinks about enabling, giving people some options around lump sum payments if that's what they want to do.
Okay, thanks for those questions, members, and the participation in the workshop that preceded. Now, I think we'll put this to the vote. Now, one thing, members, there's probably the need to back up with an oral submission, and I'm very happy for others to do that. I don't think we actually need a motion on that every time, though. I think we can work with the staff, and if I sense leadership, I know the Deputy Mayor's taken a big interest in this, Councillor Simpson's taken an interest, we can do that. Sorry. Yeah, I know. And a lot of other people have had an interest. I think we can work that out outside of the meeting. Okay, so I'll move, and it's moved and seconded. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried.